cut Muhammad, our friend, saying to him, "This is the first UK man who is going to be late 2 minutes on his meeting."
Okay.
Nice to be here. I think this is the first time to meet face to face.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. We have just 2 or 3 of our Siyasat researcher who are going to attend this very short meeting. Okay, we can just start. Just to make a best use of our time. Let me first to thank you for being here with us today. We are going to publish the academic translation of your blog post regarding public policy in a book, and it will be available for free for almost anyone who is interested in public policy. And we thought this would be an event to just meet with you, and it was a kind of personal interest, because I have a short story here. When I started studying public policy, I was searching for concept and theory in Arabic. I didn't find much. Then I started searching in English. And as I'm coming from a medical background, I'm not used to just go to the library and academic books. So I started searching on the internet. And your blog was the first thing that I reached to, and I found them insightful, and I found the podcast. So I thought, okay, I have right now the writing and then the teaching. Why should I care about master in public policy? Later I discovered this is not a right way of thinking, and life is not as simple as this. So let me first ask you why you put all your writing and podcasts for free on the internet.
Okay. Well, so I started. I've always been interested in trying to explain quite complex concepts in a simple way, and so I think you've got levels of challenge. One is to help students understand it. So I would do that in a textbook.
Yes.
And then, I think, I'll sound old, but blogs were becoming more popular back then, 10 or so years ago. So I thought it would be a good way to find an accessible way into the study of complex concepts. So the way I describe it to students is, if they start with a short blog post, it'll help them understand some basics. Then they can look at a textbook chapter, and then they can use that knowledge to get into the source material. And I think that's for students who might, if they go straight to a state-of-the-art article in a theory, I think they'll often get lost because there are so many assumptions made about the knowledge of the reader that it's hard for someone to begin. So that's why I would do the blog post first, just to introduce people to something in a kind of concise and helpful way.
Yeah, so the beginning, it was like an introduction for the students. But I think many other than students were reaching for these posts. For us, and from my personal experience, I find many people trying to just know about public policy. And this concept, at least from where I come, in MENA region, it's likely vague, and there is not complete understanding of what does it mean. So, and also I found that you have put also the podcast. You are just trying to make all your resources. If you didn't understand what I'm writing here, I'm trying to explain in details what does this mean.
The podcast. So I think I'm better writing than talking. So I did put some time into the podcasts, but again, just to introduce things, so I don't, at a master's level, I don't give long lectures to students. I give them these short explainer podcasts just so they know enough, they become familiar, that they can read on, and then we'll discuss what those, what the implications in more detail. I think that works. I certainly tend to be quite bored by long lectures on topics, so I just assume that it would be the same for my audience. So I think they're about 15 minutes or something, 15, 20, 25 minutes, just as an explainer. And I try and tone down the accent as well. I put on the professional accent for 20 minutes.
Yeah, but from the beginning, do you have this goal that you are trying to bring a public audience to the public policy issues and trying to inform them in one way or another regarding how to deal with those public challenges or how to think about them?
Yeah.
Because this issue is not just for academic or students.
Yeah. Well, for most of the time, I see my audience as my students. So I start there. Then, so I started to notice that you can track the stats, the traffic on your website. And I started to notice that some of the posts were being recommended on other university modules. So I thought, okay, I've got a bigger audience here for students. And then Google searches, that sort of thing. So so for example, the most read thing is on the policy cycle. So people are Googling that phrase policy cycle, and I'm telling them it's not particularly useful. So I started to realize that there was more of an audience for some of the concepts that kind of cut through, more than the technical ones. So that was fine, but I'm not convinced that people need to know a lot about these concepts unless they're studying them. If I knew I was only speaking with people who, wanted to take sort of practical lessons from these theories, I would write them in a different way. And I have tried to write, so I've tried to write some things that essentially say, what if you want to do this? That's much more of, I think the role I have there is to say, okay, well, I've read all these theories. I can synthesize some of their insights and apply them to some of these issues.
But this would be interesting if you try to write like this. Because for practitioners and those who are coming from executives branches, they find those concepts good for them because they enlighten some areas that they didn't consider before. But still, they don't want to go to the academic life. They don't just go to speak about theory. So just making bridge between this kind of theory and practice and trying to write those theories just for practitioners or executive, it would be a good thing, I think.
Yeah, so, I think the first time I tried to do that, second time I tried to do that properly was with the study of evidence-based policymaking. So I used to read a lot of articles, either as a reviewer or just as an interested reader, on essentially researchers disappointed that there was such a gap between the stuff they were producing and policymakers using it. And I think what I was trying to work through was, I think that's partly because their expectations of policymaking are unrealistic based on these simple models, a cycle or something like that. And so I think these theories, if you explain the insights from these theories, they can help people understand a much more complicated policy process and navigate it more than they would if they were expecting something simple. Even then, I think there's a difference between being able to conceptualize this process and to influence it, because a lot of the theories that I'm interested in, they're primarily there just to study, policymaking system. That study does not translate directly into advice on and how to navigate work within it. You know, so, but I think there are some things like I think people are quite keen on this idea of a policy entrepreneur that has these skills and that they can suddenly open doors and make things happen. And I think a key insight there is that, you know, the study of policy entrepreneurs in policy theories is really about their environment. Their environment is much more influential than they are. And it's a good corrective to this idea that if they can just develop these skills, they're going to suddenly make a difference.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the comments that I received from regarding those articles, that they might seem like slightly disappointing, because when we are speaking policy cycle from a traditional point of view, they are saying to the people, you know, this is the policy cycle, this is how life goes. And then it comes to them and saying in the articles, no, life is different from this. Also in the policy entrepreneur. So some readers say that, okay, it becomes for us slightly disappointing. We find that, okay, at first we feel that this policy cycle helps us, but now we discover that it's not true, what we should do right now.
Yeah. I mean, I should say it's not my fault that these things don't exist. Yeah, I think if the world was as simple, then, you know, people providing evidence, for example, they would know when to do it. There would be this stage called agenda setting, and they'd be able to give the evidence on the size of a problem and its urgency. And then you'd move on to formulation, and then they would give you this evidence on what solutions work more than others, that sort of thing. And then they would help evaluate at the end, and that'd be fine. But I think if you kind of harness these insights, they give you a sense of the need to be more agile or adaptable to a system that can, you know, where these functions can happen in any order. And, you know, the role of individuals trying to influence it are less clear. But they're not, you know, they're not completely disenchanting. So I think it's just like with the entrepreneur thing, I think it's just two sides of the same coin. On one side, you say most entrepreneurs fail, you know, as in business, as in politics. But on the other side, you can say, oh, under these conditions, they can be more or less successful. And I think for me, that's not so much disappointment. It's about managing expectations. I think you're only disappointed in life if you have inflated expectations about your impact on the world. And if you have these managed expectations about what people can do, it's more about trying to understand the system in which they operate than to, you know, suddenly change it. Yeah.
So for managing the expectation, our expectation at first in translation, me and Marwa, that it will be an easy task. But then we discovered that having very short sentences and numbers does mean that there are many meanings and understandings that we can find in the same sentences. So this was your intention from the beginning, trying to condense the meaning in a very short sentences, or what you were trying to do?
I think I do have this tendency. So I'm trying to explain the same thing in fewer and fewer words. Yes. And I suppose that's akin to, you know, it's just more concentration. So, or, you know, I suppose we've now got this thing where you vacuum pack things into small spaces, but it's the same mass, you know, it's just in a smaller space. So I think there is an issue there. It looks like, you see 500 words, you think, okay, I can read this in a few minutes. But it's really just a way to introduce things so that you can read more. You know, it's never a substitute for wider reading, you know. So I suppose there are lots of choices you could make here about how much you focus on. I mean, a good example, I think, is sometimes I will do these extra posts where they kind of zoom into one concept more, you know, rather than just trying to do everything. So there's one that tries to describe the difference between uncertainty and ambiguity. You know, so the bigger discussion is about your bounded rationality, about how people process information. But this one is specifically about this difference, again, with practical lessons. So I think often scientists will try and deal with policy processes by trying to reduce uncertainty, provide more and more information so that your uncertainty about the world reduces. But then you would say most policy theories are really about this study of ambiguity, which is there are many different ways to interpret the world or policy problems, and people compete to determine which is the most, the most dominant way of interpreting things. And so, that's an example where you would zoom in and say, okay, well, if you accept this strong role for ambiguity, then the provision of evidence is not enough. Because first you have to understand how people understand the world and policy problems and how they demand information. And so I think, that's an example where, it's a kind of side topic where you can, hopefully that one was easier to translate than the others.
No, we have tried to do our best. Still, we receive feedback from those who are reading the articles. And actually, one of the comments that we were receiving, that those articles are trying to bring more questions than answers. So we started reading, hoping that we will find an answer for a single question. Then the article ends with a summary, trying to bring more questions for us. I think this was in purpose.
Yes, well, certainly with the 500-word posts, because I was thinking my audience was students, I was thinking, okay, well, these are questions for seminars, further discussion, further reflection or something. I mean, the other thing is, part of the reason I don't or can't give answers is because there's no way that these theories could provide a convincing answer about everything in the world that we're interested in. And in fact, most of them are based on the study of a very small number of countries in a very short time period. So I think we need to be careful about not trying to extrapolate too much from them. So there, I would say, I can give this a good example of something definitive is to say that there's this ideal type that we call comprehensive rationality. Policymakers can process all information and their choices are consistent and they know what will happen when they do things. And then you say, well, really, we're interested in bounded rationality when they can only understand a small proportion of the world. They interpret it in different ways. And so that, I would say that's a kind of universal kind of statement. No person or government has the ability to process all information. So we're interested in how they deal with that. What rules or beliefs or other functions do they use to try and interpret the world in a limited way? And I think as soon as you ask a question like that, you would say there's only so far you can go, because the way that someone would deal with those limitations would vary by country, from country to country. It might vary from person to person or sector to sector. So these questions become researchable. They say, how do we find out how people process information? And that prompts lots of different approaches. So it does prompt you to read more. But I think because to just stop with bounded rationality, I think would be very limited.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, one of the challenges here we received that actually there is an attitude that regarding those theories are coming from the Western liberal democratic countries, and in the MENA region we have this kind of political polarization and economic instability and kind of wars and conflicts. So to what extent those concept or theory would be suitable for a context like this? And then this kind of debate, why we should care regarding translation of these theories and concepts instead of just focusing on our local domestic policy-making process. What do you think about this debate?
So I am sympathetic to it. There have been some developments in the field. So almost all of these theories started as studies of the US, and then they increasingly became applied to European countries or Western European countries, and then further afield. And it's only recently that people have tried to use similar concepts to explain what's going on in across the world rather than a small part of it. And I think so if we go back to the bounded rationality thing, you can say there are these core concepts that are useful regardless of the study. So because it prompts research questions that we can all ask, which is, for example, how do policymakers resolve ambiguity? So if the issue is there are lots of different ways to interpret this policy problem, then our research question is how do people resolve it? So I think you might say, well, the traditional answer in a liberal democracy is that there's there's some kind of competition between groups and among politicians to gain the upper hand on how to define things. It might be you say, well, if it's an authoritarian state, there may be a much smaller number of actors involved in resolving that ambiguity.
Yeah.
And then so that's so it's the same concepts, the same language, but different conclusions, for example.
Yeah.
Then there are more interesting ones. The things that interest me would be like there's this traditional focus on, actually, that these went out of fashion, but this idea of what are the limits to making policy from the top down or from the center. And these are liberal democratic experiences, but they suggest, if you try and, the center has too few resources to understand what would happen. It doesn't have resources to direct everyone involved in delivery, that sort of thing. And I think it might be that some of those conclusions would change in other political systems, but there would still be these limitations in terms of coordinative capacity, for example, or even being able to know what happens when you make a statement and what happens in the real world. And I think what I've noticed in some of these sort of policy theory studies in non-Western countries is sometimes they're identifying an amplification of the things they found in liberal democracies. So for example, the kind of famous one now is it's punctuated equilibrium theory, and it shows this distribution of policy change. There is, a huge number of small changes and a small number of huge changes. And I think, people have done studies, say, comparing liberal democracies and authoritarian states, and they just find an accentuation of that pattern. Far fewer, far more small changes and, a small number of huge changes, but these changes are transformational. And I think you could explain it with the same language, which is it takes a huge amount of energy to overcome, friction or stasis. And when it happens, it really happens.
Yeah.
So, I think at least the theories give us a language to communicate with each other and compare experiences without expecting that they're going to be the same.
Yes. I think here, regarding comparing liberal democratic with authoritarian countries, still concepts can make a shared language to make this comparison possible. Yeah. And still, we should be aware of the difference while doing this. One of the projects that we're thinking about, we're just trying to bring scholars from Europe and scholars from MENA region in policy issues, and then trying to find what kind of similarities, what kind of difference, and if they are working in the same topic or on the same subject. Concept would be a shared language to start with.
Yeah, I think so. And I suppose there's a couple of other contexts for me. I mean, one is, so I increasingly tell people that I only really know a lot about UK.
Yeah.
So I couldn't give you an account of liberal democracies or Western countries. That's too broad for me. So I'm a UK specialist, but I just know these theories. I suppose the other thing is there's a slight tension between policy studies and other approaches to political science, I think, and one of them would be sort of traditional comparative politics, where my story of comparative politics would be you start with all of these differences between political systems, and then you explore that impact on and your expectations for different outcomes. And I think in that context, policy theories provides some sort of some cautionary tales about these expectations, because they say, well, their formal institutions are very different. But a big part of the point of these policy theories is that a lot of these are to do with informal rules or universal constraints on policy change that would be found in any country. So you put those two things together, then you have understandable expectations that these systems are different and will have different dynamics, but also the ability to identify commonalities in terms of the concepts of use. So it's just trying to find a balance between that, similarity and difference.
Yeah, good. Okay, I just have just a very two short questions, and then we might expect to receive one or two questions from our researcher. The first one I would like to ask, if you are going to use this articles for an ideal student in your mind, how you would expect this ideal student to make best use of those articles? Because we received this question many times.
Okay. Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I have several kinds of ideal student. Okay, so I wrote about this this short article called Teaching Policy Analysis or something like that, and I would say I know that there are people with different expectations or engagement. So on the one hand, there's someone who is going to do a PhD in policy theories, and they have years to understand at least one of these concepts. On the other hand, you might have people doing an executive training module, and they've got 4 hours. And so the interesting thing for me is how do you design a form of learning within that range? So I think for me, the ideal student is simply one just willing to engage for the amount of time they have to engage and according to the resources they have. But in terms of, so mostly I teach a master's now, sort of postgrad level. And I suppose the ideal for me is they start with some blog posts, maybe a podcast if they want. They then read on textbook stuff. They read some of the source material. And then we all come together in a class and we talk through what these concepts mean. And I work out what they know and what they still need to know. And so they're just willing to engage and tell me what they know, and then apply this to case studies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, good.
So that's fine. But often people will just get in touch and say, okay, I'm doing a PhD or I'm doing a dissertation or something like that. Can you help me understand one part of this? Yeah. And that's fine too. If I can help out, I've read more. I've invested the time, then fine.
Yeah. Okay. Just one final question. I'm very curious to know your idea regarding if we make this kind of academic articles available online, and then it becomes available not just for the university students, even for those who are finished their university or just curious about public policy. And then we make like a weekly meeting, just bringing them. They are going to read those articles and then make discussions, but in their context, regional context from the main regions, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, or any other countries. Do you think this idea could be possible, some kind of university, but it's online and without university rules?
Yeah, I'd imagine. These things depend on the energy of the people willing to learn, don't they? So if there's enough people willing to learn, then fine. I think when I teach at university, the reward is this degree that you can use for an employer to say I'm trained. But there are other uses to speaking together about concepts and applications, just learning about the world and informing practice or something. I'm sure it's fine.
Good. Okay, I'm just opening the floor for anyone here. If you can receive one or two questions. I think Hafiz would like to give a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Paul. It was great to read your book, and it's very insightful. I am Al-Hafid Nawini. I'm PhD in political science and international law. So I just have this question. It's about what we live in now. It's we have a lot of new tech, we have a lot of AI. So I'm curious about the policy, the public policy making. So is this new tech maybe can make some challenge for public policy making, or they can use it? If yes, how they can use it? I don't know. I'm curious about it. Yeah.
Well, it's relevant to me in two ways. The first thing is, this isn't quite what you're asking, but the first way it's relevant to me is that students increasingly use AI to ask the questions that I would give them the answers to in my blog. So they'll put into, ChatGPT, what is public policy or something like that. And actually, I still think that, the humans are still winning that one, because we're still able to talk about the definitions they get back from AI and identify the problems with those definitions. Because I think that's one of those things. I think people say that what these functions are there to do is to try and answer a question you provide, whereas some questions we ask, they are not answerable. They're just there to prompt discussion. So what is public policy is a good example where it is essentially trying too hard to give you an answer, and you can think about how interesting that is, about what it doesn't really provide. I think in terms of AI for decision making, certainly in the UK, there's a huge interest in the ability to try and harness machine learning to help reduce uncertainty. I think if you can gather more and more information about policy problems, more and more information about what people have tried to do and what works, then it promises this huge reward. So fine, but I think then I think the insights we have is, even based on what we talked about before, is that this process is not simply about reducing uncertainty. It's about resolving ambiguity. People have different beliefs, different interests, and you can't have a technical way to resolve these problems as if it's a mathematical problem. It's a political problem we're trying to deal with. So I think there'll always be limits there. But I think that there are some interesting. I've been trying to think about the extent to which I could automate some of the things I do. So a good example is that I've become very interested in these systematic reviews of policy concepts and looking for advice on how to influence policy from studies. And I think that I could use some kind of AI procedure to systematize the search for information. Because you're talking about, how do you formulate keywords and how do you search for lots of databases in a way that reduces time. I think that's possible. But I've noticed when I do those kinds of things, there's still a huge amount of human discretion about what you think is relevant or not. It's very difficult to put into something like simple code. And I'm not sure what the implications of that are. Does it suggest that two different reviews would be, two different people doing the same review would produce really different results? So I'm not sure. I think certainly there's a huge interest in this field, isn't it? Certainly there's a lot of governments in countries like the UK are putting a huge amount of money into trying to work out the possibilities. But it's still quite early, isn't it?
Okay, good. I'm not sure if anyone else have a question, but I just would like to thank Marwa because she worked with me in translation of this book. Actually, she has a master in translation, but public policy was not her major. So it was hard for her in some cases to work in translation, some concept and theory. So I'd like to thank her, and lastly to thank you for your attendance. And I hope we just keep in touch. We might working on translating policy analysis, but right now I think we should have a very strong plan for this.
I should say that I did call the policy analysis series 750 words, but if you look at them, you see that very few of them are 750. They're long. So if you did want to do that, it would make sense, essentially, for you to tell me the ones that you're most interested in, and I could probably shorten them to make them more translatable. You know, I'd be happy to do that if you were investing the time.
Okay. Well, we are going to work on this, but I think we should make some kind of plans and how we are going to divide the work. But it's on our agenda.
Yeah, good. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hope we can meet again.
Yeah, good to meet you all. Good luck.